Okay, maybe a couple of people still um, join, but let's start already. Welcome everyone to this webinar, which we called a learning session. And it's great to see that there are so many of you joining today. This is a learning session or webinar that's organized by War on Want, the Transnational Institute, PowerShift, and the European Trade Justice Coalition, which many of you probably know under the previous name of Seattle to Brussels Network, and we're currently in a phase of rebranding and renaming ourselves. As the European Trade Justice Coalition, we wanted to use these weeks and months and to look a little bit beyond the work we've been doing recently on free trade agreements and the Energy Charter Treaty and explore some new topics that are of interest for us and others in civil society around trade, around climate, and agriculture. And so today is the first of three sessions. Where we talk about raw materials. Then tomorrow already at 11 a.m. CEST, so 10 a.m. for everyone in the UK, there will be a session with someone from Via Campesina on agriculture and their vision for trade in agricultural products. And then next Tuesday, at the same time, so exactly in 1 week time, there will be a third session on the question of green subsidies and what they mean for global trade, for climate change, and how we as progressive civil society can engage with them. But today we wanted to start with by taking, in some sense, maybe a fresh look at an old topic, at raw materials. It's something that many of us in civil society have worked on for a long time, and we've often focused on the harms of extraction of raw materials and of the overconsumption of raw materials, and those are very real. In the trade compendium, we've also looked at how free trade agreements or trade rules constrain the ability of countries to regulate those sectors. Today, we wanted to take a slightly different look and ask the question if or how raw materials can be used for economic and social development, because that's often now at the forefront of countries look at the energy transition and some of the minerals that will be needed for it. So we want to see what strategies countries can employ to make use of their raw materials, but also look at the downsides that such an approach brings. And we're very excited to have two very interesting speakers today. And really want to thank them for getting up early or staying up late for us to make this webinar possible. The first speaker is Tim Sahay, who is the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. It's a new think tank that brings together expertise on the energy transition, on supply chains and industrial policy, and that's what we'll hear from him about today as well. He's also co-editor of the Polycrisis blog, which you should all check out or subscribe to if you haven't done that yet, and we'll share a link to the blog. And he used to work for the Green New Deal Network, so he knows the social movement side of these questions as well. We'll hear from Tim about the research that the center has done on how countries can leverage their mineral wealth for their development. After Tim, we'll have Rachmi Hertanti, who is a lawyer with a specialization on trade law and who's a researcher at the Transnational Institute. She's also a member of the Indonesian Economic Justice Coalition, and for many years she used to direct the Indonesians for Global Justice, which is a great NGO and ally for many of us in Indonesia. And Rachmi has been publishing and researching on Indonesia's approach to mineral supply chains. So first we'll hand it over to Tim, then we hear from Rachmi, and then there will be lots of time first for Q&A, and then also some extra time for discussions among us about what we take away from these presentations today and how we might want to take this forward. So over to you, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Fabian, and thank you to all of you for working for so many years on this really important issue. Can I just make sure that somebody can tell me that you can see my entire screen? Yeah, Fabian?
Not yet, no.
Now?
No,
Oh, I just need to actually share my screen. Okay. Now perhaps. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so as sort of Fabian said that, I'm at Johns Hopkins University where we have a net zero industrial policy lab, and the lab is an advisory consultancy sort of a lab to many developing countries around the world, including Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, Korea. And our goal is to sort of make sure that developing countries, do not suffer sort of recolonization in this period of sort of green protectionism, and make sure that they can develop using the resources that they have and the know-how that they have. So today's sort of talk is about this sort of problem of mining and economic development. And as sort of Fabian said, like we have a lot of us have been working on this issue, and mining is generally seen as a dirty extractive industry. This is, but can it be transformed is the major question, and can it be used to sort of increase the country's development prospects? So one of the sort of this table sort of like basically summarizes my talk. So we can sort of come back to this. We usually focus on consumer countries of mining metals whose main focus is to sort of secure their access to critical materials, right? And these are countries often in the global north. And we tend to usually sort of ignore the sort of if not ignore is the wrong word, but just sort of like minimize the policy initiatives that countries in the global south are making to increase their own domestic benefits. And these sort of domestic measures often take the form of capturing more of the revenue from their raw material resources in the form of taxes, in the form of nationally owned companies, and sometimes in the form of outright sort of expropriation of foreign asset owners in their country. And they do things like export restrictions, they do things like demand domestic processing requirements. And today I just sort of wanted to lay out, what is the strategy behind all of this. This particular figure is from IRENA's 2023 report. So the main way in which we tend to think about the problems faced by metal-rich countries is the metaphor of the resource curse. Mining is a highly unstable, volatile industry. The resources in a country often tend to be owned by extractive elites. Mines themselves do not necessarily bring many jobs to any country because they tend to be very capital intensive and never really create enough jobs. And then lastly, the sort of the big problem of mining development is that it is much cheaper to extract metals in a very dirty way rather than in a sustainable green way. So this is sort of the ways in which we tend to think about the problems of mining, and the problem of how any country could conceivably develop from mining. We generally end up saying, no, they can't. These are very fundamental problems, and countries are going to have a very hard time overcoming these problems. And today I kind of wanted to sort of take an alternate sort of view to sort of have a look at how countries are exploring sort of new paths to break out of this resource curse. And that's the problem of economic development And the problem of economic development is basically how do you diversify an economy so that you become more complex over time and you're not entirely dependent upon a single resource. And you want to do this in a sustainable, equitable way that actually enhances the basic needs and the capabilities of your people. So that's the problem of economic development. So now we have sort of two problems that I've laid out. One is the problem of mining, and the other is the problem of economic development. And the thing that kind of joins them together is this question of industrial policy. And industrial policy, I'll sort of lay out some of the ways in which countries are exploring using good industrial policy to allow for economic development to happen through mining. So first things first is, this is one of the tools that countries have been using, which is that of stopping any raw materials from being exported from their country. So later today, we'll hear from Rachmi, who'll be telling us about the broader case from Indonesia. But I just wanted to point out that this is a very general trend. This is not a 2020s development. This has been happening, at least since the late 2000s. And we have this is a table from the OECD of all the countries that are installing some kind of export restrictions. And they have, a database where over 80 countries have export restrictions. And so the question that, we should ask ourselves is why? And, the countries will state a very clear reason. They say, we don't want the natural wealth from our country to go out in an unprocessed way because the value created from just exporting raw materials is minuscule compared to the value created from processing those metals and developing more and more industries downstream of those metals. So that's the rationale given. And so that rationale, has a deep sort of theory of change behind it. And I'm sure many of you would be familiar, or if you're not familiar, this is a quick primer on Carlota Perez's work of how do you actually leverage your natural resource sector to create a more complex economy. And she, started from sort of thinking broadly about Latin America, but this is a generally applicable thing that mineral-rich countries can use their natural resources and create more downstream value-added manufacturing networks out of that. And to do that, you don't just need an investment into the mine, into the metal itself, but into all kinds of adjacent supply chains out of that resource. So that's where you get things like local content restrictions, where you demand that the mine is serviced and supplied by local companies that are providing engineering services, technical services, and out of those services, you attach a human capital investments where you make sure that they have, people are learning a lot of knowledge intensive skills. You invest more in human capital in local universities and so how, and the goal being that you develop out of that mineral sector, you develop a whole cluster of firms, a cluster of universities, a cluster of training colleges, all of which would allow the country to then move into more complex tasks, such as manufacturing metals or chemical processing, and eventually sort of move out of that in single resource. Okay, and I'll just sort of give a quick example from Malaysia. I know Rachmi will be giving an example of how this has sort of worked out in Indonesia. So Malaysia in the 1970s was a very classic, highly resource-dependent economy that had a lot of tin and rubber, and it was so resource-intensive that just those two commodities accounted for 85% of Malaysia's exports. But Malaysia today has a lot of value-added industries in petroleum refining, value-added industries in electronics, in electrical, in rubber products, in cars, in manufacturing. And so, the question to ask is, how did that happen over the course of the last 30, 40 years? And it's because, as I said, of sustained sort of industrial policy to move up from the rubber and the tin into more complex tasks. And the way that was done is a really sort of remarkable story. It's very similar to the Indonesia strategy in the 2010s, but basically they undertook a lot of R&D. They attracted firms that did foreign direct investments, so factories that actually did more manufacturing steps, and they made sure that all of the money that was being earned from these foreign exports were then plowed back into the sector to develop to move up the ladder. So this is the sort of thing that can be done and has been done in many places. And sadly, this is also a strategy that has not worked out for sub-Saharan Africa. So this is this is from a very recent IMF report from 2024, which sort of asks the question, in which kinds of places has this strategy worked out, where you do more value-added steps, and which kinds of places has this strategy not worked out? So on the x-axis here is if you're further to the right, then that means that you're doing more extractive industries. And if you're further to the left, then you've moved downstream and you're doing more domestic value added and more processing steps. So China, as you can see, is a country that over the last 20, 30 years, this time axis starts from the year 2000. So just literally the last 24, 25 years. China has moved much further into processing, which all of us who work in mining and metals know is that China has become sort of the processing and the refining kind of hub of the world, where raw materials from Australia, from Canada, from Indonesia, from a lot of countries go to China and are then refined and processed in China. So China is not a surprise there. Indonesia is a surprise there, but we will learn exactly what that strategy looked like from Rachmi later. And then the really sort of the story that we tend to focus upon, which is that extraction leads nowhere. You cannot actually develop out of an extraction-based industry. That is really sort of a story of sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan African mineral-rich countries have remained in the stage where most of the value is not being captured domestically. Instead, most of the value, so the countries are largely exporting raw materials, and the metals are moving up somewhere else. Usually countries in the global north, whether it's Europe, whether it's China, but the value from the industry is not being captured in sub-Saharan Africa. So I just sort of wanted to sort of make the case that it is possible. We've seen lots of examples of countries that have moved up the value ladder. In other words, they have developed as an economy leveraging their natural resources. And there are very, very many worrying examples of countries where the model has remained a highly extractive, largely foreign-owned industry, as in the case of many sub-Saharan African countries. The industries tend to be foreign-owned. Very little of the value tends to be captured domestically, and therefore not enough local jobs or local know-how is being created in those economies. And the problem really is that of the classic problem of mining, just an enclave, just a completely separated part of the economy, which is delinked from the entire economy. So it's just an enclave where the mining happens, all of the extraction happens, and most of the value is sort of siphoned out, and the money is made elsewhere. So this is the very serious problem of mining, making a country sort of stagnate and remain in that extractive zone. But it is also possible to use industrial policy creatively. And I don't think, this group sort of really needs to know that, the mining sector has very severe ESG problems, particularly for indigenous communities, for the conditions of labor, the sort of the destruction of biodiversity through deforestation that happens through bad predatory sort of mining practices. But then again, the solutions are very, very obvious in solving these problems, but they really require the country to have more domestic ownership of their mining resources and the ability to sort of create institutions that can monitor the predatory practices and eliminate them. I will stop there and leave it for Rachmi to take on.
Thank you, Tim. That was really interesting, fascinating. And for me, there were already lots of questions that came out of your presentation, but it was very thought-provoking. So now I'd like to pass on to Rachmi, who will give us a view into this Indonesian example that we also saw on the chart, and an overview of policies that have happened, and also how they've been perceived in Indonesia.
Yeah, thanks, Fabian, and also thanks the team that already presented about this. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting to see how the developing countries would like to have more improvements in their economic model. As Tim said, that we need more diversify our economic model if you want to create more growth in the country, for example. And I think I just want to mention or share with you that actually Tim already presented to us, because I would like to say the fundamental aspect in current phenomena of the resources nationalisms, for example, in many developing countries that actually connect with the dependency movements that we already heard before in the Latin America's experience in the past. And we are experiencing right now how Indonesians, for example, would like to use this kind of momentum to get more potential to grow, using our comparative advantage, like natural resources based industry, for example. So Indonesians can get more benefit if they can change the model of productions from only the extractions to the idea to have more processing industry in the country, as Tim presented in his PowerPoint. But also, we have to also remember, as Tim mentions, that the idea, for example, or the trend of export restrictions, and also the idea to have or to develop downstream industry actually is not happen only in 2020s, but also already happened in the late of 2000s, for example. This is also connect with the Indonesia agenda. So actually the idea to have more value-added productions in Indonesia has been promoted since 2007, under the President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono administrations. If you remember, in the past, before Jokowi, SBY or Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono itself had promoted an economic acceleration program called MP3EI. Actually, that's also quite similar with the program that has been done so far by the Jokowi administrations today. So the plans under this idea, the value-added productions in Indonesia, actually to develop value chains through processing products, diversification, structural deepening, vertical integrations, by strengthening inter-industry relations, yeah, etc. I mean, that kind of the idea, the added value of economic using the comparative advantage of Indonesia's. And I guess the global financial crisis that occurred in 2008 continued to drive down the performance of Indonesian industries. And also because we too dependent with the extractions economic model, export only the raw materials that also enjoy the commodity boom, right? Because most of the companies who really benefit from these activities really enjoy the commodity boom. But when the end of the commodity boom in 2012, for example, it looks like that Indonesia's we experience, the conditions of the industrializations in Indonesia, and also the expansions of market, for example, and trade liberalizations policies also has resulted in low competitiveness of national industries and dependence on imports. And I guess the conditions after the financial crisis in 2008, and then the deepening economic crisis in 2018, I guess, after the US-China trade war, for example, the financial situations of Indonesia quite depreciated, yeah, to the current conditions because we imported too much rather than we export. Yeah, because we too dependent. Our industries too dependent with imports product at that time. So we need to make more productive activities in our industries, how to rebuild the industrializations agenda in the countries. That's why Jokowi need to continue the agenda from SBY. And then we can see since 2014, in his second term of the presidency, we can see how Indonesia can improve the implementations of the industrializations agenda. Because in that year, we have to remember that the government passed the industrial law, right, in 2014. And then the implementation of this law is carried out through the Blueprint for the National Industrial Development Master Plan, or we call it RIPIN. And which aims, this RIPIN to encourage economic control from upstream to downstream based on primary raw materials. So actually, we already realized that we can diversify our economy using the comparative advantage that we have, the abundance of natural resources, not only on mining, but also agriculture, also oil and gas, actually. These three sectors, actually the priority of industrialization's agenda in our country under this industrial law at that time. Even on nickel, in 2014, after the government passed the industrial law, they didn't think about how Indonesia would have a production chain of EV batteries, right? They only think how to improve nickel productions, to process it into stainless steel only. So that's why when we think about industrializations, we need more infrastructure projects. And we also rely stainless steel by import products. So that's why Indonesia would like to think how we can build this strategic industry for Indonesia's infrastructure development, where at that time we too relying on that products import from China, for example. That's actually the first idea on added value productions in Indonesia from nickel. But then after the pandemic COVID-19, for example, and then the increasing trend of Green New Deal, yeah, the transitions of economic to more green, for example, I think these situations become an important turning point, yeah, for Indonesia to revisit the economic diversification strategy at that time and how it can push a big leap for the implementation itself. And I guess our government finally has that kind of momentum, not only political momentum, but also the economical momentum at that time. How for Indonesia increase or improve their economic development and using the natural resources as a comparative advantage. So Indonesia must take on specializations and new roles in global value chain activities, yeah, in developing our national industries. So I think that's at least the added value productions agenda already started by the government since a decade ago, yeah. Not only during this time, during the energy transitions agenda, but they already realized that Indonesia needs to do something if they want to improve their economic at that time. And I guess with the rising trend, of course, the critical minerals needed for energy and digital transitions nowadays, plus with the geopolitical context, yeah, because the geopolitical tensions also add more momentum, yeah, political momentum for developing countries like Indonesia, who has an abundance of natural resources, right? That especially critical minerals needed for this kind of transitions, while on the other side, global north really dependent to these resource-rich developing countries, right? Using as theme presentations, as you can see that how the global north create trade investment policies, international regulations, blah, 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 just to ensure that they can access this kind of natural resources provided by the developing countries. But at that time, I guess Jokowi also realized, then he instructed that we need to consistently implement the domestic processing obligations of raw minerals, yeah, prior to export, and focusing the mineral downstream industries to develop the production chains on several energy sectors. And you know also, right, the case between the European Union's versus Indonesia at the WTO. That's because of the implementation of these policies, how Indonesia should defend the national interest to yeah, I mean, to get more benefit in the context of economic development agenda. And in the context of critical minerals-based industries, I guess following to the situations, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Indonesia developed several grand strategies, yeah, for mineral commodity downstream industry to become a roadmap for national industrialization's development. And they already decided that Indonesia has 47 critical minerals prioritized to be used as national strategic industrial priority based on Indonesian mineral resources. At least there are 3 national strategic industrial priorities. First is, of course, the battery industry for electric vehicles. Second, we also prioritizing the minerals to produce solar panel industry. And the third, we also, Indonesia also think to have, to use the minerals, the critical minerals for our defense and health industry. And the 3 national strategic industries will be focused on nickel, cobalt, copper, gold, rare earth elements. I think that's mostly the critical minerals that Indonesia will targeting, yeah, to be banned as a raw materials, and also how to process it in the countries. Or if not, if we don't have that kind of resource, we also need to, Indonesia needs to have more cooperations with the countries who have this kind of strategic minerals itself. And in the implementation side, I guess we have the president regulations to ensure the accelerations on the battery electric vehicle program. Yeah, there are several strategic used by the Indonesia. So it's not only talking about industrial policy. When we are talking about added value, it is industrial, but then it will be very complex policies at national level, because not only in the context how to develop our industry, but also to connect it with the investment climates in our country, to ensure how the investment can be facilitated well by the governments, ensure that they can access the land, access the cheap labor, blah, blah, blah. So this is also complement with that kind of regulations that finally lowering the standard of environmental could be, also lowering the standard of the labor, for example. And also we have another policies that should in line with this kind of agenda, like fiscal, non-fiscal incentive, as Tim also presented, that developing countries need to give tax allowance for the investors who would like to invest in the processing and industries in these sectors, for example, because it's not really easy, you know, because for example, it's like in the EV battery productions, yeah, how to ensure that Indonesia can produce locally. The main element of policy in this context is not only on the export ban, but also to ensure that the industries, the processing industries, until in this kind of production chains, should use local productions. That's why the obligations of local content requirements is really important if you want to ensure that developing countries can benefit from this agenda. But once again, the implementation of local content requirements is not really easy, because first, if you want to develop the domestic industries or capable to have manufacture that can produce the production chains of EV, that's also not only depends on the finance, but also depends on the transfer, the technology, or the technology, where most of developing countries doesn't have that kind of technology, and mostly it monopolized by the developed country, by the multinational corporations. That's really complex, and that's once again connected with the international trade policies that already preventing the developing countries can access or use that kind of flexibilities existed in these regulations, for example. And also on the other side, beside the EV, for example, because the energy transitions also in parallel, yeah, I mean, needs access to reliable energy services, yeah. And it means that if you want to build industrializations, we need more energy. And mostly the main sources of energy in Indonesia still lie in fossils, for example, like coals, etc. And that's why it's really connect with the plan of Indonesia under the Just Energy Transitions partnerships. As you know that when Indonesia became the presidency of G20 in 2022, Indonesia and international partners group launched the JETP program, and IPG promised Indonesia to finance the energy transitions project for about 20 billion US dollar. And last year, I think the Secretariat of JETP released a comprehensive investment and policy plan document, yeah, that guide the government in Indonesia to have a more clear agenda on energy transitions, especially in the electricity sector. So it can complement between the downstream industry with the energy sector, because as you know that at least with renewable energy, the industry can use more green energy instead using the electricity with the main source from coal, for example. So that's in line, yeah. So it's very comprehensive agenda if we can see from the Indonesian side. So when you're talking about mineral-based industry, it's not only talking about how to use the minerals to produce it, to process it, and how to take benefit what Indonesia can get from there. Because under this JETP, one of the elements, as I mentioned to you earlier, the focus of one of the investment recommendations under this JETP actually called I forgot. It's about the supply chains on solar panel. So I guess this is quite important to see how the agenda of mineral processing industry in Indonesia very well planned from the government sides. But we have to remind, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that the phenomena of resources nationalisms in developing countries like in Indonesia, also Tim already mentions about it, it looks like that it still become the same resource curse that we are going to face, because once again, it still lies with the existing structure of exploitations, the structure of business, the ownerships of the projects, for example, etc. I mean, we can see that this is the new model of neocolonialisms, or we call it as a green colonialisms in this new era of green economic transitions. So that's why sometimes in the positions of social movement in Indonesia, we need to critically, yeah, to discuss about this kind of development agenda, yeah, in Indonesia, and how we can put the counter narrative or this model agenda, the development agenda provided by the government side. So I think that's the thing. It is important for the people's movement right now, especially in Indonesia, how we can reimagine, yeah, the development models from this agenda right now. I think that's from my side, Fabian. Sorry if I took the time so long.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Rachmi. That was, yeah, very fascinating to see how also all those different connections and linkages that you talked about, that I think Tim already hinted at it in his presentation. I just briefly wanted to see, Tim, if there's anything you wanted to react to in particular, and then I would already encourage everyone else to think of their questions that they might want to ask to Tim and Rachmi.
If I could just add one thing, just reacting to what Rachmi said, the question about two things, actually. One, the question about technology transfer, and two, the question about how do you do mining and processing of mining, which is extremely energy intensive. You know, how do you actually make that green, right? So those are two extremely important questions, and metal-rich countries particularly, I mean, you can think of the Indonesian example, but generally speaking, processing of metals is very energy intensive, and they tends to use the cheapest source of energy available. In some countries, that cheap source of energy can be hydropower. So a lot of the processing in the US, in Canada, etc., comes from hydroelectricity. And in many other countries, it is coal power. So whatever is the cheapest source of energy, it tends to be used for processing. So if we are thinking about any kind of development outcome, how do we turn the metals into green metals requires a massive deployment of clean energy. And that's not going to happen magically. It's going to require exactly what we've been saying for a long time, financing from north to south, and technology transfers from north to south. And going to the first question of the technology transfers, basically mining is extremely dirty. I worked in a copper mine for 2 years in Utah, actually. And even in the global north, mining is just extremely polluting, extremely dirty, and companies don't follow laws unless they're forced to follow laws, either by social movements or by other actors. In the case of Utah, it was, the ski industry and the tourism industry that put pressure on the mining industry to say, look, if you dirty up the environment and you're belching out cold smoke, no one is going to come and visit for tourism purposes. So it requires a very complex political economy calculation of who can stop the mining sector from doing the dirty things and transition towards cleaner things. And that process requires domestic pressure and international pressure.
Thanks, Tim. That was really two, I think, really important aspects. I have lots of questions, but I've already talked a lot, so I would really encourage others to come in now with their questions. You can